The F1 paddock rumours are circulating once again, with two teams reportedly being investigated for potentially breaking the financial regulations in 2021. So what happens if there's a breach and how severe should the punishments be? Let's have a look. My name's Andy and this is Behind the Drive. A breach of the budget cap. It's important to note that everything that is being reported right now regarding potential financial breaches is rumour and speculation, but the reports are suggesting that both Aston Martin and Red Bull are being investigated further regarding the financial reports that they submitted at the end of March. All teams have gone through this process and the FIA is preparing to certify each of the teams regarding their 2021 expenditure. Last season was the first with the new $145 million budget cap, which was actually slightly higher due to sprint races and the number of rounds in the season. The regulations are rightfully vague regarding the potential punishments for teams that breach this limit. There are minor breaches for spends that are less than 5% more than the budget cap, then there are material overspends for any expenditure that's in excess of 5% of the limit. Now 5% doesn't sound like a lot, however 5% of the 2021 budget cap is more than $7.25 million. Which is a huge amount of money when you consider the number of people that you could recruit and pay for with that kind of money. Not only this, but Christian Horner has told the media that the in-season development budget for Red Bull is around $8 million in total. So there's a real potential for the team to benefit significantly even with a minor breach in the limit if the overspend was on car development. Plus, this advantage from last year would not only affect the 2021 season, but also have long-term benefits for the new aerodynamic regulations that were introduced for this year. This advantage could then be sustained into 2023 and beyond. So this is the main reason why so many teams have been vocal about the potential breach in these regulations, as it could even bring the sport into disrepute. For me, I think that if the top team in the sport in Red Bull is found to have spent significantly more than they should have done, and for me, even the 5% minor overspend is significantly more, then there should be repercussions that impact them and act as a deterrent for any other teams in the years to come. The potential punishments available to the FIA include public reprimands, deductions in Constructors' or Drivers' Championship points from the season where the breach occurred, suspension from stages of the competition, so essentially race bans, limits on the future aerodynamic testing, and then also a reduction of the cost cap for a rule-breaking team. Now these penalties are broad, and they would have a significant impact on any team. The FIA has kept it broad to determine each penalty based on the individual situations. One of the key points in the way these regulations are written is the fact that the championship points could be deducted from the drivers or constructor, which would potentially change the result of a competition that concluded around 10 months ago. This kind of change in result would be unprecedented in Formula 1, and it's very rare in broader sports as well, with athletes being caught doping and having Olympic medals taken away retrospectively being the only example that I can think of. But before we take a look at Red Bull and Aston Martin in particular, I want to take a moment to ask you to consider subscribing to Behind the Drive. I'm aiming for 60,000 subscribers by the end of this season, so if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button. An honest mistake. One thing that needs to be considered when you look at the Red Bull or Aston Martin examples is the fact that this was the first year where the accounts have had to be submitted with the limits being imposed. Not only this, but the teams will have been following the same approach to their spending this year on the basis that their assumed accounting method for last season would work again. So I think this issue, if it has occurred for the last year, may reoccur again in the future. Having said this, the teams did submit an interim report at the end of June in 2021, which showed the expenditure to date for the teams. So the process has been followed before. It's unlikely that the FIA forensic accountants would have been able to spend so much time on the investigations as they will have done for the end-of-year reports. Now I would like to believe that all of the teams will have been honest in their reports and won't have tried to get around the new regulations. And there has been confidence from Christian Horner that the report that they submitted was well within the $145 million limit. It'll be very difficult to prove whether a breach of the cap was an honest mistake or not, but I expect this is one of the reasons why the potential available punishments are broad and non-specific. The key challenge regarding this situation is the fact that one of the teams in question is Red Bull, the team that won the Drivers' Championship in Abu Dhabi in controversial circumstances. Let's hypothetically say that Red Bull breached the cost cap by 5% in 2021, and the punishment selected is a proportional reduction in the championship points for the team and drivers. In the case of the Constructors' Championship, Red Bull's points would reduce from 585.5 to 556.2, which wouldn't make a difference to the overall standings as they would still finish second. In the case of Sergio Perez, his points would reduce from 190 to 180.5, and he would remain fourth. And then in the case of Max Verstappen, his points total would reduce from 395.5 to 375.7. This would put him behind Lewis Hamilton in those standings. Of course, this would be highly controversial, and it would be discussed for years to come. But at the same time, one of the alternate options of financial penalties tend to have a pretty insignificant impact on the most wealthy teams in Formula 1. So the way to penalise the top teams must be severe enough to put them and their rivals off breaking the rules again in the future. So this is where the reduction in budget for the future or the reduction in aero testing time could be utilised. At the same time, the other school of thought is the fact that when teams are caught cheating, they should be disqualified. You just have to look back at McLaren in 2007, who were disqualified for stealing intellectual property from Ferrari, which gave them an advantage. In this scenario, the drivers cooperated with the investigation and were not disqualified themselves. So even though they benefited from the information gathered by the team as it would have helped them improve the car, they were still able to keep hold of their championship points. The financial reporting could be deemed to have similarities to this in that neither Verstappen nor Perez would have had any influence over how much money is being spent on the car, so they are innocent parties in the case of the budget cap. So perhaps this is a precedent that could be considered when looking at this breach. Lessons must be learned from elsewhere. If the financial regulations are broken, the FIA must penalise the team significantly. I think that Formula 1 could look at the financial fair play situation in football as an example. The regulation has been in place for more than 10 years, so it's a good reference point of how financial regulations have been implemented elsewhere. The goal of financial fair play is to prevent football clubs from getting into debt through excessive transfer spending. This was something that was happening more and more. Now, this regulation is spread over several years, with net losses being evaluated over a 3-year period. So it is perhaps more difficult to regulate than the cost cap in Formula 1, which is fundamentally based on a single season's expenses. The public perception of financial fair play is that it hasn't been working. Many teams seem to be able to keep spending whatever they want, and the teams are able to use creative accounting to avoid breaching the rules and allegedly overinflating sponsorship income. Many teams have been fined for breaking the regulations in the past, but again, much like in Formula 1, it feels like fining teams for breaking financial fair play is futile. Plus, in the past, teams have been found to be in breach, and they were even banned from certain competitions, but after a court case, they seem to get away with it. So it shows that in other sports, financial regulations have been very difficult to implement. Formula 1 must learn from this. The budget cap is arguably a simpler regulation when compared with financial fair play. However, the accounting itself has more exclusions and inclusions, which make things difficult to measure. But there is a key difference between the sports, and that is the fact that in football, the system is based on losses. So if a team has huge incomes with sponsorship, they can spend more as well. So there is an inherent status quo in the hierarchy in the game. Meanwhile, in Formula 1, the financial regulations are intended to be a leveller, where all the teams can spend at the limit and have the same opportunities to produce the best car possible. As a result, a team in minor or material breach of the financial regulations has fundamentally cheated. For me, if the FIA wants to show these regulations are just as important as the sporting and technical regulations, then there needs to be a big enforcement of the rules that disincentivises any team that may consider breaking these rules in the future as well. If any team has broken the rules, then there needs to be a way to resolve it. Personally, I'm not opposed to exclusion from the championship for the team or teams in question. However, the impact on the Drivers' Championship feels more difficult to justify. However, alternate options like ongoing penalties such as reduction in the team's cost cap in the future seasons or their wind tunnel aero testing time could be punishments to consider as well, as they have a longer term impact on the sustained advantage received by a team that has broken the rules. Right now, we don't know if Red Bull or Aston Martin have been in breach of the financial regulations. Reports are saying that one has had a minor breach and one has had a material breach. But as I mentioned right at the beginning of this video, this is just speculation at this point in time. At the end of the day, this is the first time that this has happened in Formula 1, so nobody knows what will happen. The context with Red Bull being one of the two teams involved is particularly fascinating, so we'll have to wait and see what happens next.